In the heart of a cold American town, where broken windows lined forgotten streets and the wind carried stories no one listened to, lived a poor orphan named Eli Walker. He was only 12, yet life had aged him beyond his years. Every morning, before the sun rose, Eli would wake alone in a cramped room of the old orphanage. There were no lullabies, no warm hands to brush his hair, no one to say goodnight. Just silence and the ticking of a clock that never lied. Eli had no family, no money, and no one waiting for him at the end of the day. But he had one dream: to finish school, to learn, and to become someone his late mother would be proud of. He clung to that dream like it was air. Day after day, he worked odd jobs around town, sweeping the bakery floors, shining dusty shoes outside the train station, even collecting soda cans from trash bins, all to gather enough coins for his school fees. He kept the money in a worn-out envelope he hid beneath the sole of his shoe. It was everything to him. Every penny had a story. Every dollar meant hours of sweat and silent hunger. But life had a way of testing those with little. One freezing afternoon, as the sky turned gray and snow began to fall, Eli saw a figure curled up near the alley by Johnson's Market. It was an old man, dressed in tattered clothes, his hands trembling, his lips pale. People passed by without so much as a glance. But Eli, he stopped. He watched the man for a long moment, heart aching with a pain he knew all too well. Hunger, cold, loneliness. And then Eli did something unimaginable. With stiff fingers, he reached into his shoe, pulled out the envelope, the same envelope that held every hope he had, and placed it gently in the man's shaking hands. He whispered. No words. He didn't wait for thanks. He simply walked away, shivering, but lighter somehow. That night, he returned to the orphanage with nothing, no money, no warmth, no explanation. But as he curled beneath his thin blanket, tears on his cheeks and stomach empty, there was peace. In his heart, he had chosen kindness, and somewhere in the distance, the old man unfolded the envelope, read the contents, and stared into the dark with eyes that remembered. But Eli had no idea what fate had just begun to turn. In the silence of early dawn, the town awoke to its usual grayness. The streets remained cold, the sidewalks littered with yesterday's footprints, and the whispers of people who never stayed long enough to care. But far away from the noise, in a quiet room overlooking the city, a man sat at the edge of a polished bed, staring at an envelope. It was torn at the edges, smudged by dirt and wet snow. But the handwriting on it was clear. Inside, a few wrinkled dollar bills and coins had been carefully arranged, not enough to change a man's life, not enough to even buy a full meal in this city. Unless you knew the story behind each cent. The man, once thought to be just another forgotten beggar, was not what he appeared to be. His name was Henry Whitmore, and he hadn't always been alone, nor poor. Years ago, he was the brilliant founder of a tech company that reshaped lives across the country. But after losing his wife and son in a terrible accident, Henry disappeared from the public eye. He vanished into grief, refusing comfort, walking away from everything, his company, his wealth, his name. He began wandering the streets in silence, hoping to find something worth believing in again. And that cold afternoon, sitting in the alley, he had found it. Not in a building, not in a bank, but in a boy. A small, fragile boy with hollow cheeks and silent kindness. That envelope spoke, louder than any voice ever had. Eli never knew that his act of compassion had lit a fire in a broken man's soul. While he spent the next day trying to explain to his teacher why he couldn't pay, swallowing shame like it was breakfast, Henry Whitmore was making calls, reopening accounts, putting on a suit for the first time in years. But Eli only knew hunger. He sat alone at lunch while others ate. He stared at the chalkboard while numbers danced before tired eyes. Yet he never complained. Not once. The world had taken everything from him, his parents, his home, even his name. But not his heart. And across the city, the man who once ruled towers of glass and gold was watching the orphan from afar. Quietly, closely, remembering something he hadn't felt in years, hope. But Eli remained unaware. He didn't know that someone was now asking about him, his full name, his school, the orphanage he lived in. He didn't know that his name had passed through the lips of one of the city's richest men. He didn't know that fate was drawing its lines, and his life was about to change forever. The air inside the orphanage grew colder as winter thickened. The heaters sputtered, the food portions shrank, and the children's laughter became more like echoes than joy. Eli continued to rise before the others, slipping quietly into town, to look for new ways to earn just enough to survive. He never mentioned the envelope he gave away, not to the caretakers, not to his teachers, not even to himself. He buried that memory deep, hoping no one would notice the emptiness it left behind. But the world was beginning to notice Eli, just not in the way he expected. At school, the principal had begun receiving strange phone calls, anonymous inquiries, soft voices asking about a boy named Eli Walker, his performance, his background. Even the head of the orphanage was visited by a sharply dressed man with a leather briefcase and eyes that didn't match his smile. He didn't stay long. Just asked a few questions, nodded, and left with a name scribbled in his notebook. Meanwhile, Eli had no idea that he had become the center of something far greater than his own story. While he scrubbed floors and washed chalkboards for extra coins, people in suits whispered his name in elevators and conference rooms, and Henry Whitmore watched. Not directly, not yet, but through people he trusted, silent assistants, loyal staff who once built an empire with him before he disappeared from the world. Henry asked them to follow, to observe, to learn everything about the boy, who gave up everything without expecting anything in return. What they found broke his heart even more. Eli had no relatives, no support, no dreams beyond staying in school, and maybe one day working in a grocery store. He owned one pair of shoes, mended with tape. He skipped meals so others could eat. And still, he smiled. The more Henry learned, the more a storm began to rise inside him, not of pity, but of determination. This boy, this nameless poor orphan, had unknowingly rekindled a soul that the world believed was lost forever. Henry Whitmore had once created machines that connected millions, and now all he wanted to do was give one lonely boy the thing he never had, a future worth waking up for. But Eli remained unaware. To him, life hadn't changed. Not yet. He was still the invisible boy sweeping doorways, collecting cans, and silently wishing his mother could see him from wherever she rested. What he didn't know was that everything around him was already shifting, and very soon he would no longer be invisible. Snow continued to fall across the city, blanketing sidewalks and rooftops in silence. It was the kind of cold that settled deep in the bones, reminding those without warmth just how alone they truly were. Eli sat by the window in the orphanage, holding a folded piece of paper that had yellowed with age. It was the only thing he had from his mother, a letter she wrote before she died, but never had the chance to give to him. He never read it aloud. He didn't need to. He had memorized every curve of the ink, every crease in the fold. It spoke to him like a lullaby from a world that once held love. It was all he had and all he needed. That night, while the other children slept, Eli stepped outside, letting the snow land on his cheeks like forgotten kisses. He didn't know why his heart felt heavier than usual, but somewhere inside, he felt that something was coming. Something that wasn't made of cold or sorrow. Across the city, in a building filled with polished wood and framed memories, Henry Whitmore stared out of his own window. But his thoughts were not with business or boardrooms. They were with a boy whose pain mirrored his own. The difference was that Eli still chose to give. While Henry had spent years running away, Henry stood in front of a mirror that hadn't seen his reflection in a long time. He brushed the dust off a photograph on his desk, a boy who once called him Dad. That boy was gone now, taken in the same accident that had stolen Henry's world. But Eli had reminded him what it meant to care again. That night, Henry made a decision. He would no longer watch from afar. It was time to meet the boy who had unknowingly saved him. It was time to bring light into a life that had known only shadows. But Eli, unaware of the storm quietly building behind him, continued to wake up the next morning just as he always had, early, alone, and hungry. He walked through the snow-covered streets, his shoes soaked, his hands numb, heading to school with nothing but hope in his heart and a piece of bread in his pocket. He didn't know that someone was already waiting for him. He didn't know that the moment he stepped through the school gates, his life, every breath, every dream, every silent prayer, would begin to change forever. The wind was cruel that morning. It cut through the trees like glass, scraping against windows and whispering down alleyways. Eli tightened his thin jacket around his small frame as he walked toward school. His breath came in clouds, and his feet moved slower than usual. His stomach ached, but he said nothing. He never did. The school gate stood tall, like it always had, rusted at the hinges and dusted with snow. But something felt different. The teachers were standing unusually still. Some of the older students whispered behind their hands. There was a car parked across the street, black, long, and far too clean for this part of town. Eli didn't notice any of it. He just walked inside, keeping his eyes on the ground. He sat at the back of the classroom like always, trying not to be seen. But he was already being watched. From behind the glass doors of the principal's office, Henry Whitmore stood, dressed in a black coat and scarf. His eyes were fixed on the boy in the back row, the boy who looked so much smaller in person than he had in the photos. Henry felt a tightness in his chest. This was not a business meeting. This was personal. He remembered his own son at that age, the same quiet strength, the same way of shrinking into the background while carrying the weight of the world. And here Eli was, unaware, still surviving, still choosing kindness when life had never been kind to him. The principal approached Henry with a hesitant smile. But Henry wasn't interested in pleasantries. He had come for one reason. A decision had been made. The school day continued. Eli, hungry and tired, tried to focus on the board, but the words blurred. He wondered if today would be the day he'd be sent home for good. No money, no future. Just another number slipping through the cracks. But just before lunch, a message came. Eli Walker, please come to the office. He stood slowly, unsure. Whispers followed him down the hallway as they always did. He thought he was in trouble. Maybe someone found out he hadn't paid. Maybe this was the end. He walked through the door. And there, standing tall, was the man in the black coat. The room was quiet. The principal said a few words, but Eli didn't really hear them. His eyes were fixed on the stranger whose gaze held something unusual, not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. Henry stepped forward, and without a single word, he reached into his coat and pulled out the torn envelope. Eli froze. He knew that envelope. He knew what it meant. The world around him went still. In that single moment, a boy who thought he had nothing realized someone had seen him, truly seen him. For the first time in a long time, Eli didn't feel cold. He didn't feel the hunger clawing at his stomach or the weight of empty pockets pressing against his chest. What he felt instead was the shaking in his knees. Not from fear, but from something far heavier. The weight of being seen. Inside the office, silence hung thick in the air. Eli stared at the envelope in the man's hand, the very one he had surrendered days ago, not knowing it would ever return. It still had the dirt from the alley, the faint crease where he had folded it so carefully. And now it was back in. front of him, carried not by a stranger, but by someone who looked like he belonged in a world Eli had never even imagined. Henry Whitmore watched the boy closely, but he didn't speak. He let the envelope speak for itself. He wanted Eli to understand this moment, to feel its power. Outside the room, life went on. Students laughed, teachers passed by, the wind scraped against the windows. But inside, time stood still. Eli lowered his gaze, unsure of what was happening. He didn't understand why this man had followed him, why his teachers were suddenly kind, or why his name was now being whispered with a strange kind of reverence. And then, the principal stepped forward and gently placed a folder on the desk. Eli's name was printed on it, but beneath it, something new had been added. Eli Walker, candidate for Whitmore Legacy Foundation. He didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But the man in the black coat, the man with kind eyes and a name that once sat atop the tallest towers in the city, had made a choice, a silent one, a powerful one. Henry Whitmore would not walk away this time. He had watched this child suffer, give, and survive. He had seen the kind of heart that the world rarely produced anymore. And now he would give Eli something the boy had never truly known, a future. That afternoon, as the snow continued to fall, Henry visited the orphanage. He met the caretakers. He read every file. He saw every crack in the walls, every empty shelf, every frayed blanket on the children's beds. He didn't say much, but everything about him spoke of quiet promise. And back at the school, Eli sat alone again, but this time, not in despair. Something had shifted. He didn't understand what had happened that day, but he felt it. A door had opened. A warmth had entered his life, not through words, but through action. And yet, the boy still had no idea that what was coming next would rewrite his story forever. The city woke to sunlight for the first time in weeks. Snow melted into puddles, and icy streets gave way to the sound of water trickling through gutters. But the biggest shift wasn't in the weather. It was in a headline, across newspapers and digital screens. One name reappeared that the world had nearly forgotten. Henry Whitmore returns, announces legacy scholarship for Orphan. Who gave him hope. It didn't take long before every classroom in Eli's school was buzzing with the news. Reporters lined up outside the orphanage gates. Donations began pouring in. But Eli, he didn't understand any of it, not fully. All he had done was help someone who looked like they needed help more than he did. That's all. He hadn't expected anything back, but the world was now expecting everything from him. Henry didn't wait for permission. He moved fast. Buildings were contacted, lawyers were summoned, papers were signed, and within days the paperwork was complete. Eli Walker would no longer be known as just a poor orphan in a forgotten orphanage. He was now the first official heir to the Whitmore Legacy Foundation, not because of his bloodline, but because of his heart. Eli was brought to a new home, not a mansion, but a quiet house where warmth lived in every room. He received new clothes, new books, and most importantly, a new school placement, one that would prepare him for the future he'd once believed he didn't deserve. But the most powerful moment came. Weeks later, a banquet was held in Henry's honor. Wealthy donors, city leaders, and journalists filled a grand hall with lights and music. But when Henry took the stage, he didn't speak about his company, his money, or his legacy. He spoke only about a boy who gave away his dream so someone else could survive, a boy who had nothing, yet gave everything. Henry ended his speech with just one line, a line that would be quoted across the country. Eli Walker reminded me that wealth means nothing if it forgets how to see the invisible. From that day on, Eli was never invisible again. He was no longer just the boy with no family. He was the boy who changed, a broken man, the boy who became the symbol of a new legacy. The poor orphan, whose kindness had made him unforgettable,